today's World Insight with Tianwei, Venezuela's fate hangs as Russian and American top diplomats meet to ease tensions. What's the best way forward? And incalculable loss to war of the world's oldest civilization. Efforts to shield humanity's legacy from man-made destruction.
The civilization in the Middle East and even in Iraq is not owned by Arab people, but is a civilization for everyone.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tianwei, the program coming to you live on CGTN. We begin with the latest on Venezuela's political crisis. The South American nation has turned out to be another battleground for geopolitical influence between the U.S. and Russia. On Monday, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo met in Finland while the opposition mounted a failed military action against President Nicolas Maduro earlier last week. Before we get down to the discussion, let's take a look at this.
Venezuela teetering on the edge as tensions flare between Russia and the U.S. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo discussed the future of Venezuela in Finland on the sidelines of the 11th ministerial meeting of the Arctic Council.
During my contacts with my American, European and South American colleagues, I did not see any supporters of reckless military solution. I hope this overall understanding will be put into practice and there will be no military solution because it will be catastrophic.
I made clear our view that the Venezuelans deserve a democracy that doesn't have any foreign party running their country or involved in their country on a consistent basis in a military way, right? So we want the Cubans out, we want the Iranians out, we want Russia's military out.
The two sides have been at odds over Venezuela. In the past few months, Washington repeatedly urged Moscow to cease its support for President Nicolas Maduro, while Moscow stressed that Washington's interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state and threat against its leadership is a gross violation of international law. Just one day before Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Pompeo's meeting, the Russian foreign minister also met with his Venezuelan counterpart, Jorge Arriaza, in Moscow on Sunday. Russia has deep military cooperation with Venezuela. It sent a group of military advisors this year as tensions grew.
We are prepared for any scenario. The first being one of diplomacy, one of dialogue, of peace. We reach our hands out to everyone in the world to talk, but if they opt for a military option, we have an armed force, a people, a national guard that would be able not only to resist and fight, but even win and defeat any army, no matter how powerful. I hope, however, that this scenario never arises.
Mr. Arriaza also accused the U.S. of backing a failed coup attempt initiated by opposition leader Juan Guaido at the end of April, as Mr. Pompeo spoke about the possibility of military action and how the U.S. is ready to press the military button last week. The Venezuelan military leadership has since reiterated its support for the government, and President Maduro also urged soldiers to be ready to defend the homeland.
Ongoing political crisis in Venezuela. What's next? In our Beijing studio, Professor Jiang Shixue, the director of the Center for Latin American Studies from the Shanghai University. He is now in Beijing. In Caracas, we have Phil Gunson, who is a senior analyst from the International Crisis Group. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Mark Sloboda, an international relations and security analyst. Last but not least, in Washington, D.C., we are joined by Mary Cruz McGowan, the Vice President of the National Economist Club, and she is originally coming from Latin America. I want to welcome the four of you. Of course, we know you have very different opinions from one another as to the realities on the ground and the solutions. That is exactly why we need to discuss. I want to go to you first, Mr. Gunson. Coming from the International Crisis Group, which is believed by some as a more pro-West group, what do you make of the latest situation, particularly Mr. Guaido apparently losing political stakes in the last attempt for a military coup, or rather for a political coup, shall we say it that way?
Yes, the events last week certainly didn't help the opposition cause. They didn't really help Mr. Maduro either. I think, in a way, both sides are losers, and of course the Venezuelan people are losers to the extent that none of this has produced a political solution, which is the only way that we're going to solve this tremendous economic crisis and the humanitarian tragedy that it's caused. So on the ground, things are at least as complicated as they were before last Tuesday, and possibly even more so. It's reassuring in a way that the Russians and the Americans are getting together to try to talk about this, but on the other hand, it's a shame that it's reached that stage.
Ms. McGowan, coming from your perspective now living in the U.S., what do you make of the dwindling supporting rate of Mr. Guaido from the early January, let's just say, according to some local survey, 80% approval rating, to now about 50 to 60%? What does it say?
Well, he's right. He's constitutionally there. He was the president of the assembly. He was following the constitution, is the interim president of Venezuela. That's something important to stress. You know, he's not there to stay. He's going to call elections as soon this crisis passes. But yeah, they didn't plan very well. I think they had a commitment of certain military leaders, which didn't happen at the last moment. Obviously, that created a sense of doubt and a sense of despair on the populations that were supporting him. That was not good news, as my colleague said, for either side. Now, I think something I would like to say, I don't think President Maduro is the problem here. He's the face of the crisis, but he's not the problem, because the problem existed even before he came. It just got worse, obviously, and under his leadership, of lack of leadership, I would say, things are just horrendous in Venezuela. People are starving, and that has to stop. But what is important to stress is that Venezuela is not only fighting for their democracy, but for their independence. There are too many Cubans there. I think we should say that about $25,000 Cubans, according to the source you have, that are in the country, and there are the forces that are not stabilizing the peace there. Those people have to go back to the country.
All right. I'm not sure whether 25,000 people from Cuba or anywhere else is likely to make the country disabled to function in the way that it did recently, particularly. But let me go to you, Mr. Sloboda. Of course, coming in Russia, you have a very different view from our possibly two Earths. But the question really is, no matter which side is Russia supporting, it is not helpful to have outside interference in a country that is struggling within itself. Is it, Mr. Sloboda?
Yes, Anita.
Well, first of all, we have to point out that this fig leaf that the U.S. is using to justify trying to put their Muppet in charge of Venezuela and its largest proven oil reserves in the world, a fig leaf of a constitutional article, is complete nonsense. That article only provides for an interim president appointed by the National Assembly between the election and the inauguration if he is physically incapacitated or missing. So there's absolutely no constitutional grounds for this this fig leaf of justification for the U.S.-backed coup there. Not that the U.S. has any business interpreting the Venezuelan constitution at all. And the question of outside influence, certainly, I mean, we're talking a U.S.-backed coup attempt. This is a flagrant and brazen violation of international law that we have seen repeatedly by the United States in a whole train wreck of states around the world, from Iraq to Libya to Syria, that it has destroyed. However, the Russian government is there under the express invitation of the Venezuelan government. The sovereign state of Venezuela, its government, has the right to choose its allies under international law as it does. And it has good relations with Russia, China, Cuba, Nicaragua, and a whole host of other states that aren't trying to overthrow its government.
All right, Mr. Jiang, also your input here. We have very mixed picture right now. The current administration obviously is having difficulties to govern under the current circumstances, and yet the Mr. Guaido, which has been termed by some as so-called the Western puppet, is not winning more hearts, but rather losing more hearts. And the most important thing, Mr. Jiang, is this country is in crisis, and people are suffering as a result. So what do you think can be the role of the international community? On the one hand, not to interfere and taking sides in others' internal affairs, which China apparently holds very firm of. But on the other hand, be able to help or at least ease the pain of the situation, Mr. Jiang.
Well, I would totally agree with our panelist from Moscow. First of all, I will say that the UN...
In terms of what?
In terms of his argument.
About?
About the current situation. How to deal with this kind of a current crisis.
What is your way of dealing with the crisis?
Well, you know, first of all, the U.S. should stop imposing economic sanctions against Venezuela. Secondly, the U.S. should keep its hands off Venezuela. The final solution to the crisis is in the hands of the Venezuelan people. Okay? So Maduro was elected by the people in Venezuela. Guaido was appointed by the U.S., so to speak. So we can understand who is in the right position.
Mr. Guaido, before the crisis happened, he is the leader of the parliament of that country.
Well, according to, as our colleague from Moscow said, we need to understand the so-called constitution in the right way. Okay, so his appointment was against the constitution of Venezuela, a sovereign country in South America. Okay, so external interference should stop. Economic sanctions should stop. Let's ask the people in Venezuela to decide who will be the leader.
So you're proposing an election? Is that what you're saying, or what exactly is the solution you've been talking about?
People in Venezuela will tell you do this or do that.
Well, so without governance, it's very hard to solicit opinions, isn't it? Just to put that opinion right here. But Mr. Gunson, if you could hear me well, can you? Wonderful, sir. So
I can,
tell me about some of the latest development. One is the U.S. is trying to impose sanctions on the court leader of Venezuela. Secondly, the U.S. is trying to, likely the Vice President of the U.S. is going to make a speech about that too, giving incentives to the military who are supporting Mr. Guaido rather than the current president of Venezuela. Obviously, both of these measures, if taken place, is likely to interfere even more about the realities on the ground. The question really is, does interference lead us to solutions at all? As the Russian panelists earlier rightfully argued about some of the recent cases in which the U.S. get involved, starting from Iraq all the way up to now, and did not succeed. Mr. Gunson, from your perspective.
Well, we certainly have a lot of issues with the way in which the United States is handling this. We were against oil sanctions. We're against rattling sabers, if you like, threatening military intervention. We're certainly against a military intervention as such. We don't think it's useful that the United States government should suggest that this is all about a left-right battle between socialism and capitalism. This is about, as your other guests have said, allowing the Venezuelan people to have their say. The problem is that Mr. Maduro hasn't allowed the Venezuelan people to have their say in a free and fair election. So the issue at the moment is how to get to the point where there can be a genuine election and the will of the people can be allowed to prevail. That's not easy, It's not complicated. This has been a long time in coming. The institutions have broken down. But I think rather than interference, what's needed is help from the outside. Venezuelans won't be able to fix this on their own. That's been proven over the last 2 decades.
So you are saying to me, it seems, Mr. Ganson, rather than one layer of difficulties of trying to figure out the way forward by the Venezuelan people themselves, there's another layer of difficulty they have to handle now, which is to handle the so-called outside interference coming from the biggest powers in the world. So not only the first goal is not being achieved, but rather they have more burdens to handle at the time of crisis. Is that what you're trying to say, Mr. Ganson?
Not exactly, but close to that. I think, in fact, there are 3 layers. There's the Venezuelan crisis itself, there's the regional impact, and now we have the great powers involved. Now, that having happened, now it's clear that Russia, that China, that the United States all have interests in Venezuela, that this is not going to be fixed unless somehow those interests are reconciled. And it's in that sense that I think it's positive that Pompeo and Lavrov get together. But of course, what we want is a situation in which the interests of the Venezuelans prevail, that they predominate, and this isn't simply a deal stitched up between Washington and Moscow.
Right. Well, that certainly is one of those opinions quite popular these days, but let's take a look at another aspect of things. For example, what's going on within the U.S. politics and therefore having its impact on its possible approach toward the current crisis in Venezuela. There are speculations, according to some media reports, that President Trump is out of step with his own advisors on the role Russia is playing in the crisis and some of the other issues as well. When Mr. Trump said the Russian president is not looking at all to get involved in Venezuela, other than he'd like to see something positive for Venezuela. Secretary Pompeo and National Security Advisor John Bolton accused Russia and Cuba of maneuvering to keep Maduro clinging to power, quote unquote. Now, the issue is not about what I'm trying to say here. Whether Russia is involved or not, we're going to ask a Russian expert about that. But the issue really here is, Ms. McGowan, since you are in the U.S. right now, whether the current administration is having a concerted policy toward Venezuela, or they're having daily divisions about their approach, which would mean adding more pressure about unpredictability from one of the biggest powers in the world, Washington, toward what's going on in Venezuela. Ms. McGowan.
Well, this is a very difficult issue, obviously, something that cannot be solved. But one thing is important. The United States doesn't want for this to lead to an international military conflict.
No. May I just ask my question again? You're not answering my question. I'm afraid, Ms. McGowan. My question really is there division within the administration? And it's apparent on a daily basis almost what to approach and how to approach the Venezuela crisis, including whether Russia is involved or not, even among the administration officials. That is the question.
No. There is the president. The president has the last word. He consults, and also Congress has an opinion. That's not a division. It's just people are talking, people are negotiating, people are trying to see what will be the best solution from different areas of the government, but of course the president has the last word. He's the commander-in-chief if this gets to something more serious. But that doesn't mean there is a division. There are discussions, and I think those are healthy discussions. The president is not a dictator. He's the president. He has to consult with his advisors. He has to consult with both branches of Congress. He has to see the legality. He has to see the pros and cons. He has to see not only the political side, but the economic side. So that's what he's doing. It is a very difficult problem. And addressing to what my colleagues my colleague from Russia said, let's say this is a sovereign, legitimate government from President Maduro. Obviously, President Maduro's government, as legitimate as he thinks it is doing a terrible job, because people are starving, and people are not starving after the sanctions that U.S. put. The U.S. put those sanctions because people are suffering, people are starving, they don't have medicines, they don't have health.
So you're saying that there should be more rounds of sanctions against the people in Venezuela because they are already starving? Is that what you're saying, Ms. McGowan?
No, I am saying that the sanctions are coming to the people in Venezuela that are causing this problem, not to the people of Venezuela.
Okay.
The United States has been a step front, providing food, providing medicines, and everybody saw that, and the neighboring countries too. And even we have records that President Maduro was not allowing for that aid to reach some people. So if that's good leadership, I don't know.
Let me have the Russian counterpart, Mr. Sloboda, to also respond to that. Okay, Mr. Sloboda, make sure you are responding toward a limited time, okay? And because we have more questions for you. Briefly respond, please.
Yes. Of course, this is nonsense. A report by the renowned U.S. economists Jeffrey Sachs and Mark Weisbrot have identified that the illegal and unilateral U.S. sanctions and economics warfare that topple the government in Venezuela have resulted directly in the deaths of 40,000 people. 40,000 people. And that's directly linked to the U.S.'s illegal economic sanctions and economic warfare that need to be lifted. And the U.S. needs to return to international law. And secondly, of course, Venezuela had free and fair elections. The opinion of the International Crisis Group flies in the face of international operators, and denying legitimacy and denying agency to the people of foreign countries is a standard tactic for the United States, saying nothing of their own corrupt and rigged political system.
Okay. So another issue, since we all of you express your opinions, another issue important is, Mr. Jiang, that it's very likely the current administration in Washington would decide on sanctions, on the so-called secondary sanctions, meaning countries and companies and organizations, international or regional, that are dealing with Venezuela, including buying the Venezuela oil or working with the Venezuela projects, are likely to be sanctioned as a result by United States unilaterally. So we see that also, for example, as the U.S. approach toward Iran. U.S. sanctions.
Cuba also Cuba.
U.S. sanctions companies coming from Europe, for example, of doing that, interacting with Iran, even though there were previous nuclear peace agreements, the so-called JCPOA, that all parties agreed upon. So my question to you is, Mr. Jiang, what do you make of that possibility? What does that mean to the current crisis in Venezuela? As we know, 90%, 90, of the export revenue coming from Venezuela are coming from the oil industry.
As you know that in human history, economic sanction has been proved it's useless. Okay, so for the crisis in Venezuela, we can say economic sanction is not good for Venezuela, for the people in this country, and military intervention is not good. The only solution, the only decisive solution to the crisis is political dialogue.
But now, you can say that. You can say that, Mr. Jiang. Mr. Jiang, you can say that. But no, you can't say that. Yes, you can. But the issue is, what if the U.S. did that? And how would the other countries respond if the U.S. took actions like that, unilateral actions?
Well, as you know, that China is criticized by the U.S. for offering all kinds of help for the country of Venezuela. Economic help for Venezuela is good for the people in Venezuela. Economic sanction is not good for Venezuela. So everybody can understand this simple logic. Okay, so just let me finish my conclusion. The only solution to the crisis is through political dialogue. And Maduro said, well, we can sit down and talk. And Guaido said, no, I'm not going to talk to you. You need to step down. So regime change is the only purpose for the U.S. and Guaido, and that's not the solution for the crisis.
If there were political talk, as you mentioned,
Yes.
what format will it take? Is there real discussions about that, or is just the solution being thrown out there and say, let's just have political talk?
Well, let's see that some countries, even China, can play a kind of mediation role, you know, for this kind of crisis.
The permanent members of the Security Council, that's what you're trying to propose?
Well, some countries, some impartial countries, I think can play the role as a mediator.
Okay. We also want the other three guests, very briefly, to help us understand what do you think should be the solutions. We have about 30 to 45 seconds for every one of you. Let's go to you, Ms. McGowan.
Well, we should let the Venezuelans to determine the destiny of their own country. Take all the people that are not Venezuelans and not doing business legally in Venezuela to get out of there.
Okay. And Mr. Sloboda, coming from Russia.
Yes, the first thing that needs to happen is the U.S. needs to end its active attempts to overthrow the Venezuelan government. Then it and its allies need to end their illegal and unilateral sanctions without the remit of the UN Security Council against the Venezuelan people. At that point, the Venezuelan people are perfectly capable of solving their own political tensions and difficulties in their country by themselves.
Last but not least, Mr. Gunson, coming from the International Crisis Group.
Yes, I'm afraid they're not. I mean, I'm afraid that's just not true. They haven't been able to do it. Outside help is required. It's not going to come, I hope, in the form of military intervention. That would be disastrous. What is needed is serious negotiation, not dialogue. The government here is continually offering dialogue, but what dialogue means to them is to sit down and talk endlessly while they remain in power. There needs to be something substantive put on the table. And in particular, there needs to be the restoration of the powers of the National Assembly, a new electoral council, and basically a re-institutionalization of the country, if you like, under international supervision.
Certainly complicated, no matter which approach we are talking about proposed by the four of you. But certainly we're going to follow the latest situation on the ground, as this is very important for the people, at least in Venezuela. Thank you so much, the four of you, offering your insights. Phil Gunson, Mark Sloboda, Mary Cruz McGowan, last but not least, Jiang Shixue. Thank you so much. You are watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, incalculable loss to war of the world's oldest civilizations, efforts to shield humanity's legacy from man-made destruction, right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. How do we preserve and nurture culture for prosperity? Throughout the ages, culture flourished throughout people and monuments, objects, and the arts. Their loss is a big blow to the world heritage. Iraq is one of those very important examples. The victory over ISIL was declared in 2017, but the country is still a long way from recovering what has been lost. Where there were once streets and buildings are now bare ruins and dirt. Antiquities from civilization as old as hundreds and even thousands of years ago have been damaged and looted, but global restoration efforts are underway, one step, though, at a time. As the Conference on Dialogue of Civilization will take place later this month in Beijing, we look back to an interview I did with the former Iraqi Minister of Culture, Tourism, and Antiquities. But before that, here's a quick look at the extent of the damage we've seen over there.
A civilization in ruins. Hatra, Iraq, once a UNESCO heritage site from the time of Alexander the Great, is now reduced to dust and rubble at the hands of ISIL. Mosul, Iraq, a city where priceless historical objects came under the hammer in similar attacks.
It's a part of everyone's history. It's a part of the people who are destroying these objects. It's a part of their history.
Syria's culture and heritage are also in the claws of ISIL, ground into dust by violence and destruction. Calls for the United Nations to do more are increasing.
They are persecuting and uprooting them from their homes and erasing all traces of their history.
The relics and treasure that a terror group does not destroy in Syria and Iraq are sold for a hefty profit. It is believed some precious items have already traveled to elsewhere through internet deals and black market trade. Without an expert eye, the goods often pass right through security checks.
Your average customs official will know if he sees a kilo of cocaine that it's automatically illegal. But if they're seeing an ancient pot, they don't know in some cases whether it's just a tourist trinket or if it's a 3,000-year-old urn.
As these historical artifacts pass through borders and ownership illegally, one can only imagine the further loss these countries feel. Syria and Iraq, once home to the most ancient and grandest civilizations, are now turning into a land of nothingness as they recover from their scars of war.
When you have the planes, when you have the ground forces, very much likely cultural heritage also being destroyed. What do you make of this? Is this necessary collateral damage or not?
We in a cabinet send a very good message to the military, Iraqi military, Peshmerga, and even paramilitaries. And we said that the archaeological sites, heritage sites, should be safeguarded by Iraqi army, but we can't control the Daesh, of course. This is something different. No one likes to hear the news about fighting, you know. We are human beings. We like to live in harmony together and in peace.
But particularly, you're the Minister of Cultural Protection. You know, in wars,
yeah,
things are going to be destroyed.
Yeah, of course, because since 2003, almost 15,000 pieces in Iraq been stolen and destroyed. Only we get back almost 4,000 of these pieces has been stolen and illicitly trafficked to the European and other countries. So it is not easy when it is a matter of looting, trafficking these archaeological pieces, and it gain money not only for ISIS but even for those people are trading with these pieces. This is not new for Iraq because we living in under such kind of circumstance since 1980 when the fighting were going on between Iraq and Iran, and after them the occupation of Kuwait, the National Alliance attacked Iraq, and after the collapse of Saddam Hussein, we've been fighting Al-Qaeda, then we fight ISIS. And therefore it is not new news for us, but of course no one in Iraq like to have such kind of life. For example, me, I'm from Kurdistan of Iraq and from Suleymaniya. I drive my car by myself in Suleymaniya without any bodyguards. But in Baghdad, I have, when I go to my office, I have more than 20 bodyguards with me with a convoy of the armored car. This is not alive if you compare it with a regular and basic line of life. ISIS is not the phenomenon related to Iraq as a country, but is related to the Middle East and the international community and the whole world. Not defeating them only on the battleground, but defeating them ideologically through doing a lot of jobs in these societies, especially in Iraq, in Syria, Northern Africa, and even in Saudi Arabia. Because the Daesh is a very dangerous phenomenon. It's not differ between who are you? Are you from Iraq, or are you from France, or are you from Poland? The issue is Daesh, in his mind, there is something is that ideologically they go back to 1,500 years ago, and they want to adopt this kind of ideology now. They don't know what is going on, or at least they want to refuse every development that's happening rapidly today in the world.
Thousands of years ago, important developments were taking place in Mesopotamia, now known as Iraq. On the floodplains of the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, fertile soil brought down from the mountains by the rivers gave rise to a much denser population.
1 square mile is city, 1 square mile is orchards, 1 square mile is clay pits, as well as the open ground of Ishtar's temple. 3 square miles and the open ground comprise Uruk.
Here, one of the early 4 ancient civilizations was born, the ancient Babylons. Under an organized government, this was where mankind first began to read, write, create laws, and live in cities. They were also the first to use the wheel, and the invention of the wagon was a transportation revolution for farming and trade. And during this time, architectural structures such as the dome, column, and arc were created. The rich and remarkable historical, cultural, and artistic legacy of ancient Iraq have since fascinated and inspired humanity for centuries.
Humanity across the history and is a common ground which bring together all the nations to understand that the civilization in Middle East and even in Iraq is not owned by Iraqi people, but is a civilization for everyone.
Mr. Minister, one of the problems when you have war going on to protect the cultural heritage is the looting. The looting is not only because of the people who looted, but also because of the people who buy from the looters. And those people are not just inside your country, they're also from all over the world. What can you do about this?
Actually, we can do little, because the sullen actions across the world, and especially in Europe and United States of America, they don't care why this piece is from Iraq or not, is looted by Daesh or not. And this is the problem. Therefore, we asking every time in conferences, meeting, workshops, that the convention should be changed, the law should be changed, because they know certainly that this piece is from Iraq, but because it is not recorded in Iraq, or because it's not given a certain number for it in our museum or wherever, therefore they think that this is not belong to Iraq. I think it is very important that salons and even international communities and the states across the world realize that these pieces should go back to the origin countries. Otherwise, the looting, illegal trafficking, and illegal auctions in the salons are going on without taking any action.
Which part of the international convention, which part of the international law do you think, Minister, according to you, should be changed for that?
I think Europe and United States of America first.
Let me go to another question, also important for your country. You are such a country with rich cultures and very different kinds of ethnic groups. For example, yourself, Kurdish. There are other officials who are coming from other ethnic groups. The question is, what kind of culture to be protected? As a minister, are you going to protect Kurdish culture mainly? How is the balance going to be kept?
No, I think the civilization in Mesopotamia is not related to Arab or to Kurd or to Turkmen or to other ethnic group. It is related to the whole people in the country. Therefore, tangible and non-tangible heritage should be protected by Iraqi people, by Iraqi government, whatever these tangible and tangible related to Kurd or to Arab or to Turkmen, because all together they shared to build such kind of civilization. And this is the important thing. And I think that we in Iraq, we don't differ between this civilization in north or southern of Iraq or in other areas.
Mr. Minister, I know you have a lot of work to do, but all the best to you and your colleague. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insights CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.